This isn't a story. This really happened. Real people, real encounters, and in some cases, real footage of something that should not exist. Deep in the woods, they realized they were not alone. Welcome to Curious Conundrums. If you enjoy true encounters like this, please like and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. I'm not monetized, and I create these videos purely for your enjoyment. Now, let's begin.
Did this mysterious video lead to the man's death? The story goes that a woman was filming her husband on a jet ski out on the lake when she heard something behind her. She turned the camera, and to her shock, what appeared to be a werewolf was standing there. The creature then charged toward her, and she ran away as the footage abruptly ended. Fortunately, she managed to escape. The video quickly gained fame in Michigan, and eventually across the USA. Thanks to numerous documentaries on werewolves that featured the footage, it became known worldwide. Could the video I shared be another genuine Dogman sighting from Georgia? A man was out walking his dog through the Georgia woods when he experienced an encounter he couldn't explain, one that terrified him to the core. As they trekked along a seemingly overgrown trail, they noticed something massive and dark ahead. The dog rushed toward the figure, and the owner hesitated but followed. Suddenly, the creature lunged out right in front of them. Its speed was astonishing, so fast that while Bigfoot remains the most well-known cryptid in Georgia, reports of Dogman-like creatures have quietly surfaced over the years, especially in remote backwoods, hunting areas, and rural roads. Could the video I shared be another genuine Dogman sighting from Georgia? According to the uploader, law enforcement was responding to a call about movement near a deserted property in the area. Upon arriving, they surveyed the scene until they eventually discovered something lurking in the bushes.
Hold the light right there. Sir, you okay? Stay with me. Oh my God. Back up. Move.
Hiding among the foliage is a thin, pale creature. It remains stationary for a few moments before suddenly darting in the opposite direction. Its movements are unnaturally swift, almost impossibly so. Upon closer inspection, it appears to have large eyes, a brown nose, and a face that combines canine and human features. The creature crossed 4 lanes of the highway in just 5 seconds, which means it was moving at an incredibly high speed, too fast to be a deer or bear. Additionally, the footage was captured in an area of the UK where there are very few wild animals, with deer being the only notable ones. Here's a rather rare and perplexing trail cam image captured in southeastern Wisconsin. The photo was taken in September 2020 when a Wisconsin farmer set up a camera to monitor his crops, but quickly wished he hadn't after seeing what it recorded. Its speed was astonishing, so fast that while Bigfoot remains the most well-known cryptid in Georgia, reports of Dogman-like creatures have quietly surfaced over the years, especially in remote backwoods, hunting areas, and rural roads. Several sightings have been reported in North Georgia, particularly in forested regions like the Blue Ridge Mountains near LJ. Hunters and campers have described seeing large, upright, wolf-like beings peering from the trees or crossing roads late at night. Witnesses often mention their unnaturally swift movement, grace, and the tendency to vanish into the underbrush, which sounds eerily familiar. Numerous reports of encounters with the so-called Dogman have fueled widespread belief in its existence. This footage is arguably the most famous werewolf sighting ever caught on camera. It was filmed in the Grand Rapids area of Michigan, USA, and what makes it so convincing to many is that it was taken long before werewolf legends became widespread. What's particularly unsettling about this incident is that it reportedly occurred just a few miles from the infamous Skinwalker Ranch, one of the most well-known sites in the U.S. for alleged paranormal and UFO activity. There's a highway called Wessex Way, which is quite busy, and for years there have been reports of werewolf sightings along the road at night. In 2007, one of these werewolves was reportedly caught on camera. In the footage from a surveillance camera, a creature that resembles a werewolf appears to dash across the road. Some believe it could be another animal, but it remains unidentified. The creature crossed 4 lanes of the highway in just 5 seconds, which means it was moving at an incredibly high speed, too fast to be a deer or bear. Additionally, the footage was captured in an area of the UK where there are very few wild animals, with deer being the only notable ones. I beg you, if you are still reading this, pass on this story as a legend. The letter ended abruptly. My father heard the roar one last time. When he emerged from the cave into the open air, darkness enveloped the forest. He had no idea how much time he had spent searching for his father, but he would still have to face the killer. Amidst the trail in the thick of the woods, he saw 2 bright amber eyes that stared at him before disappearing into the darkness. Since then, my father had not seen this mysterious beast, but I too have heard the roars from deep within the forest. People who do not know what awaits them in the darkness head towards its call. The mystery of the disappearances in these places has been unwrapped. Whether this legend is true or not is for you to decide. Only I could see a werewolf with my own eyes at least once, he thought, turning on his side and falling asleep. He woke up to a terrible roar coming from deep in the woods. The roar did not resemble that of a tiger or a lion. It sounded more like a wail, like the howl of wild dogs. He jumped in surprise and ran to his father's tent. But when he opened the tent, he found no one inside. Empty. How could this be? Where could he have gone? He whispered, fear written on his face. The roar repeated, but it was louder than before. It was heart-wrenching like a call. He crouched down, waiting to see the terrible beast. Both were understandably alarmed, and the father decided they needed to leave the woods immediately. They hurriedly fled without looking back, unwilling to investigate further. While they thought it might have been just a man, something about the figure felt very strange. Many viewers in the comments section agreed, suggesting it was a Dogman, a creature said to be half man, half dog, that roams deep within the woods. Or is it just werewolf in the car? This incident occurred near Austin, the capital of Texas. In July 1999, waitress Hilda Kelly finished her evening shift at a fast food restaurant, and after getting into her car, set off home along a night road. After a while, the girl saw a person hitchhiking. She stopped, and the stranger jumped into the back seat of her car in an instant. The girl immediately realized that a real werewolf had entered her vehicle. The creature was covered in thick, reddish-gray fur, with fangs protruding from its mouth like a lion's. The girl was so terrified that she almost lost consciousness. Many viewers in the comments speculated that the creature was a Dogman, a half-human, half-dog creature believed to roam deep within the woods. Both were unnerved by what they saw, and the father decided they needed to leave the woods immediately. They hurried away without looking back, not wanting to find out more about what they'd encountered. While they initially thought it could have been just a man, something about it seemed very off. Many viewers in the comments speculated that the creature was a Dogman, a half-human, half-dog creature believed to roam deep within the woods. Dogmen are said to be extremely dangerous, and humans are warned to stay away from them. This photograph is considered. While most Dogman legends are associated with North America, the UK surprisingly has numerous reports of Dogman or werewolf-like creatures, making this sighting plausible. Many viewers in the comments section agreed, suggesting it was a Dogman, a creature said to be half man, half dog, that roams deep within the woods. These entities are believed to be extremely dangerous, and humans are advised to stay away. Numerous reports of encounters with the so-called Dogman have fueled widespread belief in its existence. To many experts and werewolf documentaries, it couldn't have been a bear due to the way it moved. So, if you live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, be cautious. A werewolf might be on the loose. An hour later, my grandfather went to sleep, saying that he was very tired from the day. Apparently, the search for a suitable place for a night's rest had really worn him out. He prepared for bed, and a few minutes later, he managed to fall asleep. My father stayed alone by the dying fire. He decided that he would stay near this warm and cozy hearth until dawn. He threw a couple of logs into the dying fire. He sat and contemplated all of his grandfather's stories. The most interesting one for him was about the werewolf that his grandfather had encountered in this forest. Both were unnerved by what they saw, and the father decided they needed to leave the woods immediately. The following is a recently leaked video purportedly from the UA County Sheriff's Department. According to the uploader, law enforcement was responding to a call about movement near a deserted property in the area.
Upper-like wild men, reported throughout the 1800s, bear a stunning resemblance to the modern Bigfoot. In this video, we'll review a broad selection of strange and compelling stories from the era. In this installment, Daniel Boone shoots a wild man, capture of a Minnesota wild family, a history of Arkansas wild man encounters, and the deep folkloric traditions behind the wild men of the woods. The idea of Bigfoot as a tall, hairy biped is epitomized in its most famous moment, the enduring footage of a mysterious creature striding along Bluff Creek in the forests of Northern California, filmed by Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin in 1967. Patterson would soon afterward describe this individual, a female, as standing between 6 and 7 feet tall, with a weight estimated at 350–400 pounds. She had silvery brown hair, 2 to 4 inches long, all over except bare patches around the nose and cheeks, said Patterson. The creature's head looked human, but was larger, with a big forehead and broad nostrils. Her arms hung almost to her knees. Patterson observed that the ape-like animal left 14.5-inch footprints in the mud. These traits are what we today associate with Bigfoot, but reports of such beings stalking Americans' woodlands date much further back in time. Native Americans maintained oral history of similar creatures, such as the giant wild man with 36-inch long feet recalled in the early 20th century by Clara Pearson of the Tillamook people, who lived along the Nehalem River in western Oregon. Attested as true by Pearson, stories like this served the purpose of warning about the dangers of living in secluded environments without neighbors. In 1929, J.W. Burns popularized the hairy giant, or Sasquatch, when he collected anecdotes about these creatures from First Nations people in British Columbia and published them in Maclean's magazine. However, there is also a long history of settlers reporting encounters with Bigfoot-like creatures as they expanded into and tamed the American wilds throughout the 19th century. These accounts of wild men of the woods are numerous and tell a cumulatively consistent narrative of eerie run-ins with ape-like beings that bear resemblance to the Sasquatch of earlier times and the Bigfoot of today. In this story, we will explore a large selection of these tales as reported in the US press throughout the 1800s. European settlers brought to America their established traditions surrounding the wild man of the woods. According to folklorists Robert E. Bartholomew and Brian Regal, the wild man was a prevalent character between the 13th and 15th centuries, featuring prominently in European art and literature. However, these wild men were ordinary humans, though eccentric and possibly deranged, who fled society to live as hermits in the woods. As time went on, they began to regress into a feral state, foraging for food like animals and even growing a thick coat of hair over their bodies, wrote Bartholomew and Regal. This trope carried over to the US, such as a December 1883 case in Calcutta, Ohio, in which a hair-covered creature resembling a gorilla was believed to be an escaped lunatic, a young man who had fled the county poorhouse and took to the woods, where he subsisted by eating berries, nuts, roots, and small animals. Mysteries of Canada, scribe Hammerson Peters described how the physical and mental transformation of a person into an animal-like state is also a universal motif in First Nations traditions. These stories generally involve an evil spirit that possesses a person who has become lost in the wilderness, or who was lured there by the supernatural force. Sometimes the person had become vulnerable to this influence after committing a moral transgression. Lost to the wild, these people gradually transformed into monstrous creatures. For instance, the Nlakapamuks of southern British Columbia believed that Sasquatches were formerly human, boys and girls who had been left alone in the mountains as part of their training to become medicine men and women, and then went wild, never returning home. Throughout the 1800s, American newspapers published innumerable Wild Man of the Woods articles. It was an era when reporters would often flex their creative muscles and print sensational tall tales alongside sober events of the day. It wouldn't have been unusual for a blow-by-blow report of local politics to occupy space one column over from the latest sea serpent sighting. In the sampling of articles covered here, there are certainly a few accounts that bend credibility to the point of shattering. Others are more restrained, and there is also a healthy dose of contemporary skepticism and discussion. The Wild Woman of New York, 1896. Many of the wild man reports of the 19th century are clearly of the feral human variety, often depicting a hermit or homeless person who seemingly just wants to be left alone. In one example from May 1896, a wild woman was the source of fear and rumors throughout Columbia and Dutchess counties in New York. She slept in the swamps, knocked on the doors of isolated farmhouses to ask for food, and muttered to herself and shook her arms as she wandered the region. According to the New York World, female tramps were unheard of in that rural part of the state. Residents assumed the wild-eyed, gray-haired woman must be crazy. A World reporter investigated and ultimately tracked down the wild woman to a house in the Catskills. It turned out that her name was Maggie Smith, and she had been hired by the homeowner as domestic help for the summer. For the past few years, Smith had simply walked through the country from Albany to Hudson, a distance of about 30 miles, on the way to her place of seasonal employment. Sometimes the lines are blurred, like an August 1895 article about a wild man seen eating blackberries in a berry patch in Colebrook, Connecticut. The terrified citizens theorized it was either a baboon escaped from a menagerie or one of a pair of frightful-looking men who had fired guns at people picking berries in Indian Meadow during the previous few years. Even in the wild man accounts that describe a simian creature, they often possess a human-like head of flowing hair and a beard, similar to their cousins who appear as hermits reverting to a wild state. But there are indeed numerous reports that present the wild man as a huge and hairy beast who walks upright and is capable of savage displays of strength. This particular selection of articles highlights those wild men of the woods whose traits match up very closely with the Bigfoot we know today. On August 30, 1818, an animal resembling the yo-ho or wild man of the woods was reported by a gentleman of unquestioned veracity in the vicinity of Ellisburg on the northern border of New York State. The hairy man stepped out of the woods within a few rods, around 50 feet, of the surprised witness, stood and looked at him for a moment, then turned and fled. The yo-ho bent forward as he ran on narrow feet that spread at the toes. Hundreds of searchers went looking for the creature, but found nothing further. This apparently wasn't the first sighting in the area. The frequent and positive manner in which this story comes induces us to notice it, stated the local press. We wish not to impeach the veracity of this highly favored gentleman, yet it is proper that such naturally improbable, if not impossible events, should be established by the mouth of at least 2 or 3 eyewitnesses to entitle them to credibility. Yo-ho is probably a reference to the primate-like Yahoo featured in Jonathan Swift's 1726 satirical work Gulliver's Travels. The Yahoos are essentially livestock of the Houyhnhnms, a race of intelligent talking horses. Protagonist Lemuel Gulliver described the Yahoos he encountered as follows. At last, I beheld several animals in a field, and one or two of the same kind sitting in trees. Their shape was very singular and deformed, which a little discomposed me, so that I lay down behind a thicket to observe them better. Some of them coming forward near the place where I lay gave me an opportunity of distinctly marking their form. Their heads and breasts were covered with a thick hair, some frizzled and others lank. They had beards like goats, and a long ridge of hair down their backs, and the foreparts of their legs and feet. But the rest of their bodies was bare, so that I might see their skins, which were of a brown buff color. They had no tails, nor any hair at all on their buttocks, except about the anus, which, I presume, nature had placed there to defend them as they sat on the ground, for this posture they used, as well as lying down, and often stood on their hind feet. They climbed high trees as nimbly as a squirrel, for they had strong extended claws before and behind, terminating in sharp points and hooked. They would often spring and bound and leap with prodigious agility. The females were not so large as the males. They had long, lank hair on their heads, but none on their faces, nor anything more than a sort of down on the rest of their bodies, except about the anus and pudenda. The dugs hung between their forefeet, and often reached almost to the ground as they walked. The hair of both sexes was of several colors: brown, red, black, and yellow. Upon the whole, I never beheld in all my travels so disagreeable an animal, or one against which I naturally conceived so strong an antipathy. Gulliver was later approached in the road by a menacing Yahoo and struck it with the flat end of his short sword. This resulted in at least 40 of the creatures charging across the field at him, howling and making odious faces. Gulliver ran to a tree and leaned back against its trunk, waving around his sword to keep the Yahoos away. He continued, "Several of this cursed brood, getting hold of the branches behind, leaped up into the tree, whence they began to discharge their excrements on my head. However, I escaped pretty well by sticking close to the stem of the tree, but was almost stifled with the filth, which fell about me on every side." Despite his complete revulsion at the Yahoos, Gulliver eventually comes to disdainfully conclude that humans are merely Yahoos with reason. Daniel Boone biographer John Mack Farragut wrote that the American frontiersman often shared a tall tale late in life about how he had shot and killed a hairy, approximately 10-foot giant Boone called a Yahoo. While living in the settlement, he found it at Boonesboro, Kentucky, in spring, presumably in the late 1770s. Boone and one of his sons were out tracking indigenous horse thieves near present-day Cincinnati on the Ohio River. After realizing they were approaching a native band numbering 500, the duo wisely decided to turn back. Boone and his son briefly separated while crossing a hill below the mouth of the Licking River, when Boone heard several gunshots from his son's direction. Boone rushed over and saw the largest man he had ever seen attacking his son. The giant ripped the gun away from his son, breaking it, and lifted the young man over his head as one might raise up a child. The monster body slammed Boone's son twice to the ground, and was about to do so again, possibly killing him. Boone carefully aimed his rifle and fatally shot the giant, who fell upon his son. After freeing and reviving the young man, Boone examined the corpse of the fallen beast. It was pale yellow with long yellowish hair on its head and short hair, not very thick, covering its body. The giant measured about 10 feet, 8 inches, and had very large feet and hands. Boone was said to have given this account in 1817. According to Farragher, Boone frequently carried a copy of his favorite book, Gulliver's Travels, on his journeys into the wilderness. He enjoyed reading it by the campfire, either to himself or aloud to companions. Boone was clearly familiar with the uncouth, primitive creatures in Swift's story. The Yahoo swirls in the stew of Kentucky folklore. Yahoo Falls and nearby Yahoo Arch, with Yahoo pronounced Yay-ho by some local residents, are scenic stops within the Daniel Boone National Forest in McCreary County, Kentucky. One folk tale from the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Kentucky tells of a man who was staying near a cave when a female Yay-ho took notice of him. She would come by every day and throw a deer at him, seemingly as a gift. Eventually, she came down to visit him, and they slept together. They had a child, but the man got the urge to leave, and the Yahoo insisted he stay. The man convinced her that they would leave together on a ship, but he tricked her and boarded the vessel, crossing the waters without her. The enraged Yahoo screamed from the shoreline and, realizing she had lost the man forever, tore the baby in two and threw one half after him. Kentucky folklorist Leonard Roberts collected a handful of slightly different versions of this tale about a strong and hairy wild woman falling dangerously in love with a human male from different informants between 1948 and 1954. During my youth in these mountains, reflected Roberts, it was not unusual to hear a rumor of some half-wild man, naked and hairy, being found in the woods, living close to the animal state. Roberts wasn't sure how this story had entered Kentucky mountain folklore, and acknowledged it wasn't unique to the region. Another example of this tale explains how Yoho Cove in Maine got its name, with the gender reversal of a male Yoho kidnapping a human girl who was out picking raspberries, holding her captive and mating with her, and later tearing apart their infant when she escapes. Similar stories have been sourced from diverse locales such as French Canada, Italy, Portugal, and Persia. Andros Island in the Bahamas has a tradition of fearsome hairy men called Yahoos who move in groups within the pine yards. It is clear that Swift's story had an influence on the wild man tales that emerged in the century following its publication and beyond. It is, however, nebulous if Boone influenced the presence of the Yahoo in Kentucky folklore, or if it was already there and influenced him. Minnesota Wild Family captured wild men of the woods as depicted in the 1864 book Western Lands and Western Waters by Friedrich Gerstecker. In 1839, the Boston Times reported that Robert Lincoln, an agent of the New York Western Lumber Company, had returned from the St. Peters River, aka the Minnesota River, near the head of steamboat navigation on the upper Mississippi River, with a living American orang-outang, or wild man of the woods, and 2 small cubs supposed to be about 3 months old. According to the article, Lincoln had spent several months establishing sawmills in the pinelands around the Falls of St. Anthony in today's Minnesota, following an 1838 land treaty with the Sac and Fox Nation. In mid-January 1839, 2 carpenters from the lumber camp were pursuing a troublesome pack of wolves when they saw a huge monster standing on a log in the forest along a branch of the Mississippi River. It had the form of a man, but was much taller and stouter and covered with long hair. When the men raised their muskets, the creature darted into the thicket and disappeared. After the hunters returned to camp and told an incredulous Lincoln their story, the Native Americans there confirmed that such a creature had often been encountered near the waterfall. Native guides soon led Lincoln and an armed party to a bluff, where they encountered the creature, described as about 8 or 9 feet high, very athletic, and more like a beast standing erect than a man. The wild man yelled and fled, keeping ahead of the party for nearly an hour. The men finally surrounded the frightened creature in an open field. Before it could attack, Lincoln shot it in the leg, and the party secured the injured, howling animal with rope. They secured the monster at their camp, where two playful young of the same species soon appeared. Lincoln brought the three creatures back to his native Boston by steamer and imprisoned them in his rooms at the Elm Street Hotel. By then, the captive wild man had entered a sullen funk. He eventually accepted food, but only meat. Lincoln, an old acquaintance of the Boston Times newsroom, invited them to the hotel at number 9 Elmscent to view the strange animals. The up-close Times report noted the chained wild man's long and ill-proportioned arms, bunched and clawed fingers and toes, cow-like hide, and a head full of coarse black hair, like a horse's mane. His face had thinner hair than the rest of his body. His eyes were dull and heavy, his mouth was large and wide like a baboon's, and he lacked any distinctive eyebrows or nose. The Boston Times rejected Lincoln's suggestion that the creature was an orangutan, considering him a wild animal, somewhat resembling a man. Lincoln planned to submit the wild people for scientific inspection and public exhibition before returning to his timber operations on the upper Mississippi. "This is the first creature of the kind, we believe, ever found on this continent," wrote the Boston Times. It was to be expected, however, that in penetrating the remote recesses of the New World, monsters would be found and great natural curiosities brought to light. And it has been a matter of surprise to many that so little of the marvelous has been discovered. But we cannot tell what the wilds of the far northwest, the shores of Lake Superior, the regions of the Rocky Mountains, and the vast territory of the Oregon may yet bring forth. This fantastic story gained national coverage, but on April 6th, the Boston Daily Times came clean. The story of Robert Lincoln's Wild Man, published April 1st, had been an All Fool's Day prank. "The joke took finely," the paper gloated. Soon after the paper was issued, our citizens in great numbers began to crowd about the yard where it was said the wild man would be exhibited. And at 10 o'clock it was estimated that at least 1,000 persons had called to inquire about the monster. The keeper of the hotel, at number 9, we are sorry to say, was much annoyed by the crowd, and was finally obliged to put up a large sign marked April Fool to keep the curiosity of the throng within decent bounds. The writer recalled how 2 years earlier the paper similarly fooled Bostonians by inviting them to visit number 99 Union Street to view a menagerie that included 2 giraffes, ostriches, tigers, leopards, and an African lion that was 19 feet long. The public was so egregiously hoaxed on that occasion that we had great doubts about the success of a similar story this year. But there are a great many gulls left in the world, and those that had never been fooled before were fairly caught this time. A few of the offended readers stormed over to the Boston Daily Times office and threatened to pull down its signs in revenge. A long history of sightings around Arkansas. In 1846, a wild man double the size of an average human male in height and build was reported in the swamps near Crowell's Ridge, near the Arkansas and Missouri state line. He left tracks measuring 22 inches, with toes as long as a man's fingers. Crowell's Ridge appears to be a reference to Crowley's Ridge, a narrow rolling hill formation that extends 150 miles from southeastern Missouri to the Mississippi River near Helena, Arkansas. Later that year, there was another wild man encounter in Potosi, eastern Missouri. He was described as being 7'6" and covered with a thick coat of curly black hair. It was reported that the creature was captured in a swamp outside town and would likely be brought to Potosi and displayed in a menagerie. The 1894 capture of the Bourbon, Indiana wild man. Another wild man was sighted on Crowley's Ridge in Greene County, Arkansas during March 1851. A Mr. Hamilton and acquaintance were out hunting when they observed a drove of cattle in apparent alarm, evidently pursued by some dreaded enemy. Giving chase was a man of gigantic stature, his body covered with hair and his head topped by long locks that extended down his neck and shoulders. The wild man glared at the hunters and then ran away at great speed, leaping 12 to 14 feet at a time. The footprints he left measured 13 inches. According to the press, it was just the latest in a long history of wild man encounters in the region. The singular creature has long been known traditionally in St. Francis, Greene, and Poinsett counties, Arkansas, sportsmen and hunters having described him so long as 17 years since. A planter indeed saw him recently, but withheld his information lest he should not be credited until the account of Mr. Hamilton and his friend placed the existence of the animal beyond cavil.